Good morning. Today is Wednesday, May 23rd, and there's two bits of news I kind of want to talk about today. The first is ESPN and the UFC reached a 5-year deal that brings $1.5 billion in. Now, I think as a consumer and not a casual fan, but someone who's not in the fight game myself, I think it's going to produce a better product than the pay-per-view format that's been going on these last year or so, with these rushed pay-per-views that have had multiple people drop out and multiple people get hurt. It's just kind of something that can be a focus where a lot of these pay-per-views can go as regular fight night cards. So it's 1.5 billion over 5 years. I don't know how that breakdown happens, but I assume it's probably somewhere around 300 million a year. I think that definitely helps pay that payment down. And it starts in 2019. The way this breaks down is that there will be 30 fights per year for a UFC Fight Night. 10 will be on ESPN. 20 will be on ESPN Plus. Now, how that's going to work is going to be interesting. If Fight Pass is added to ESPN Plus, I think it can be a good thing. I think we can have a media platform that provides you all the fighting you want, as well as other sports. I think that can be a added bonus. But my one big thing is, what fights are going to be fight night fights? What fights are going to be pay-per-view fights? And how is that decision going to be made? I think it's going to be interesting going forward. This new model will probably help the UFC's profits, which might slow them down in trying to rush a lot of developing talent. And I think that's one of the biggest issues going forward, is the talent has become watered down because of this. Now, you might be asking, how can that happen? Well, you can see this with the 170 division. You have Colby Covington, you have Darren Till, you have Kamaru Usman, and you have all these young people who traditionally would have probably been given a year, maybe two, to develop. But you see them kind of pushed out as these main event number one contender matchups that might be a little premature. Now, when I say watered down, I don't necessarily mean that there's going to be less talent. What I mean is that the talent that's out there doesn't get a chance to become these great artists that have just had experience as well as talent. I don't think you're giving them a chance to gain that by pushing them out against these top level fighters. And I've seen a lot of hype on Darren Till in his upcoming fight against Wonderboy, but really, what evidence is there that he's going to be successful in that setting? Do I think he's big? Yes, I think he probably walks around maybe 210. He's a big dude. But do I think that's going to matter in that setting? No, because I think Woodley was probably walking around heavier than Thompson and had to play a very cautious game because of the counter-striking of Wonderboy. At the end of the day, do I think that he has a chance? Yes, I think he can win. But also, you got to keep into account, Thompson's wild. His kicks come from nowhere. I don't know if this is going to go the distance, but I know if it goes the distance, it's probably going to favor Thompson. He can score a lot of points and have a lot of flashy kind of moves that kind of take judges' scorecards. So why is that problematic? I think the issue becomes we have all these young talents not being developed and being pushed out. The UFC had done a good job with Sage Northcutt. They kind of gave him a few easier fights and built him up. I know he lost to Mickey Gall, but they were doing it right. They didn't give him a number one contender match, after beating one person. Do I think it's going to change a lot of things? In the short term, probably not. This goes into effect in 2019. So we probably have a year left of these super stacked cards while the UFC is trying to pay their mortgage. But I think over the long term, you'll start to see better and better fights. To be honest, I'm looking forward to it. I think I probably would buy the ESPN Plus or subscribe to it if it included Fight Pass. Because right now, my only hesitation with Fight Pass is I can see a few cool things. I can see The Ultimate Fighter. Like, I watched season 5 in its entirety last week. But really, how many times am I going to watch a lot of these older fights? I've seen them a few times now. I've gone through John Jones's library, Conor McGregor's library, BJ Penn's library. Like, I've seen them fights. I don't know if I want to pay that much money just to see them. But if it does include all of these unique to ESPN events and all these periphery kind of sports that ESPN Plus is going to put out, I know Kobe Bryant has his program on there. I think it could be something that's worth watching, worth looking out for. All right, so my second thing I kind of want to talk about today is the new guidelines, the policy about the national anthem that the NFL has adopted. So just looking through it, it looks like there's a fine if you choose to protest a national anthem. I think as an employer, you have the right to kind of expect certain behaviors from your employees. And part of that is showing respect. I'm totally with it there. But the problem is when you set a firm punishment, it becomes harder to backtrack on it. What I would have liked to see is probably an internal memo that was made public with the owner saying there's going to be a tougher stance and maybe have flexible punishment. My only concern is, what does this mean for Colin Kaepernick? I see this as the NFL kind of radicalizing against these protests and kind of being, if you protest, you're going to get fined. And there'll probably be a few people who get fined. But at the end of the day, do I think it's going to help the situation? Probably not. If anything, it might help Colin Kaepernick with his case. I mean, he's claiming that NFL has collusion towards him and blacklisted him, and this might be something that helps him out going forward. But there was a previous policy saying the players had to be on the field. They kneeled to kind of bypass that policy, but now they're saying you need to stand and be respectful, and I understand that. I'm a firm supporter of the military and the firm supporter of everything they do. Let me clarify that. I'm not saying that I support everything that our military does as a nation. All I'm saying is I support the people who sacrifice their lives, their time, and their efforts. I think some decisions made on a macro level aren't the right ones, but that has nothing to do with the wonderful young men and women who dedicate their life to protecting this country. I just wanted to get that out there just to make sure I had that covered. A lot of my closest friends have been in different branches of the military, and I understand the sacrifice that is brought from their service. But at the end of the day, I also know what the civil rights movement is about. I know what Malcolm X is about. I know what Martin Luther King was about. And I know that sometimes you have to do the things that are seen as not acceptable in order to have progress. And I think bringing up those two people are a great way to kind of describe the difference between civil rights movements. You have the violent civil rights movement, that kind of a la Malcolm X that you saw in Berkeley and in other colleges across the United States, where you had violent protests regarding the police brutality towards minorities, specifically black populations. But at the same time, you have silent protests and nonviolent protests, such as what Martin Luther King did with sit-ins and things like that. And that's where I see this kneeling as a almost sit-in towards the injustices that people have perceived to be happening. Do I think there's a problem with that in our country? Yes. Do I think this is helping the dialogue? Yes and no. I think originally it's bringing the dialogue to the international stage and to the kind of the front of people's minds. But I think it's also past its exposure, bringing a negative kind of drawback on the movement, because people are so much focusing on a player kneeling and not on why they're kneeling. Why is it that someone who is at the risk of losing millions of dollars like Colin Kaepernick, why is he continuing to kneel? Why is he doing that? It's not asked as much as, oh, he's doing that, and because of that, he needs to be punished in some punitive way. He needs to not be offered a contract. He needs to be kind of brought down. Unfortunately, I think that Colin Kaepernick probably will never play again, but I think this policy is kind of what he was watching out for. But then if you look at it from the NFL's perspective, they've been losing money, and at the end of the day, the NFL is a business, and they know that these protests have been drawing attention away from their product. It's bringing attention in the sense that people are paying attention when someone sits, but I don't think anyone who doesn't watch football is going to watch football because someone is protesting. But on the other hand, I think there are people who love football who might not be as much in love having to deal with having to listen about these protests and having to see it. So I think it hurts their bottom dollar with these protests. But at the same time, I don't think establishing a policy that fines is going to be something that's going to fix the problem. What I would have probably liked to see is have a setting, and they did it a little bit, so I can't hold it against them, but they didn't really do it in the comprehensive way I would have liked, where they created a way for players to actually have open dialogue about the police brutality and things like that. Because I'm sure there's going to be NFL players who have parents, loved ones, brothers and sisters who are police, who would have different perspectives about their loved ones and about what they're doing. So I think instead of kind of engaging in this dialogue, we're just saying, no, don't do this. And I think this fine actually is going to increase the amount of people who are protesting in the short term, because I think people are going to act negatively, right? So marijuana was illegal for the longest time in every state. And I think that kind of helped, especially the younger population, see the interest in it kind of come up more. Not that people don't smoke still, now that it's legal in California, but I think that the taboo of it being illegal is in itself a motivating factor. And I think that might happen here for players who are not only serious about this issue, but players who are trying to make a name for themselves as well. I mean, say what you want about Colin Kaepernick, but by him protesting, everybody knows who he is. And I think he's a wonderful player. I don't think he's as good as maybe some of the liberal media is making him out to be. Like, I don't think he's as good as Michael Vick, who's a much more mobile and shifty quarterback. I mean, their frames are a little different. I think Michael Vick was a little bit shorter, a little more slight. But, I mean, his legs would do things that I've never seen before. Probably will never see again in that capacity. I know we have people like Russell Wilson who also have that. But at the end of the day, I think his name became a brand because of his protests. And that's okay. he chose to make a decision and it kind of led him to where he's at now. I think he'll be okay in the long run. I don't think he'll ever be out of a job or anything like that. But I honestly think that the NFL is probably closed off to him. I don't think and I don't think it necessarily has to do with collusion. I just think that no team wants to deal with that media nightmare that is Colin Kaepernick. I mean, think about it. At your work, if you had a choice to not have that guy who would come in and kind of destabilize the office for whatever time, if it's 30 minutes, an hour in your day, would you not want that? And I think that's what Colin Kaepernick does to the NFL. He kind of destabilizes their platform. And he destabilizes their message, which is, we're with the armed forces, we're with the cops, we're with American people. And I think that is a problem for the NFL. But it's also a problem for Kaepernick, because there is a real life issue that black people are being shot dead and hurt. And I think that message has to go out. And I think that dialogue has to open, because I think there are a lot of people who would not even care. And not because they're bad people, but because their lives are so filled with things they have to worry about. They have bills to pay, kids to pick up from soccer practice, to drop off to school, make lunch for. Like, people are busy, so they don't necessarily think about what's going on in the world. But life is significantly different if you're a young black man from a low-income neighborhood versus if you're a white man from a middle-class neighborhood. And I think that is something that is not evident in the switch. Like, I think that difference doesn't quite exist for a white man in a poor neighborhood versus a black man in a middle-class neighborhood. I don't think that same dynamic exists. So I definitely see there being a place for dialogue about the racial profiling and racial violence towards blacks. I know there was just recently in the news a black student falling asleep at a university and cops being called on. I know at Starbucks there was a black person who'd sat down waiting for someone to show up before they've ordered. Something I think we've all done, right? I don't think I necessarily want to have my drink before my companion shows up and orders theirs. So I definitely see that there is an issue with black violence or cop on black violence. But I also see a history of racism that's kind of galvanized both sides. I mean, I hear so much like F the police. I did not grow up in a well-off neighborhood, and it was heavily minority, and I think the sentiment around it has always been F the police, F this, F that, and I think because of that, it kind of like galvanizes a group of people against another, and you have cops who... I love cops. I think cops are amazing. I think they're very important to our everyday life. I think 99.9% of cops out there love helping people. Whether you're black, white, Hispanic, Asian American, whatever the situation is, I think for the most part, cops are good people. Just like everybody. I think for the most part, every population is good. For the most part, all the players in the NFL are good. You have some that are perhaps probably not who you would want to be friends with, but for the most part, I think they're probably nice guys. But what happens is cops are in a constant fear of their life. Their very job is unsafe. There are dangers that don't equate to most other jobs. The reason why they wear a gun on their waist is because there's a real possibility of violence. And in that split decision, they have to make a decision on whether or not to shoot somebody, or whether or not that person has a weapon, or whether or not there is a reason to be on edge. And that fight or flight is real. It dumps adrenaline through your body, and your narrow focus. And I think that's the issue. We don't have proper training for when that adrenaline hits, what to do. And of course, there are going to be people who are a part of every organization who are racist. There was just the lawyer who went on that huge tirade about illegal immigrants in this country, right? He seemed like he probably throughout his day doesn't make those comments. He probably, before that point, he was a lawyer, so he probably met with clients. Some of them might even have been minority clients. But green money is still green no matter who it comes from. And he probably met with them and worked for them and represented them. But at the end of the day, when he had to make certain choices and to say certain things, he ended up saying something that was very negative and very disrespectful. So back to the NFL, how this kind of ties in is, I think that this anthem protest is a small kind of microcosm of the overall issue. And I don't think it's an issue per se, but I think there's an inherent bias that just comes from being different people, right? I would never presume to know the experience of being an African American during a police stop when you get pulled over. I don't know what that feels like because I don't have that frame of reference. And I think for a lot of these NFL owners and executives, for the most part, I don't think they have that reference as well. Because it's just very hard to have that reference for two reasons. One is it's not the same when you are not of that group and don't have those shared life experiences. So maybe for them, getting pulled over by the cop is, oh, you have a taillight out, or you were speeding. Here's a ticket. Let me go on with my life. But for an African American individual, it becomes, please step out of the car, please sit down. I have my hand on my weapon at all times while I'm processing this. And that can be problematic. And for the NFL, a lot, and I'm not saying I'm speaking for everyone, but for the most part, people are very well off, especially as executives and owners, especially owners. And I don't know how many of them started life out poor. I would probably imagine that very few of them started out very poor. Wealth is generational in America. Wealth can be very generational. Not all the time, right? But wealth is very generational, and wealth exists through time. Unless you're someone like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, who has this revolutionary idea that brings money in your lifetime. For the most part, wealth is accumulated over centuries and usually at the backs of other people. So I don't know if the frame of experience these owners have are the same as the players. And why I say that is because a lot of players come from low-income neighborhoods where sports and athletics are the only way out. I'm not very athletically talented, but I came from a poor neighborhood, so sports was very important to me growing up. I did high school sports. I mean, nothing more than that. Never did college sports or anything like that. I'm relatively athletic. I can play pickup games. A lot of these young men, especially a lot of these young black men, come from low-income, rent-controlled areas. And because of that, their entire life is framed by these experiences that are very negative. And their interactions with cops, often the cops don't live in the area they patrol, right? So they come from a different area, probably a slightly better off area, and come in to patrol these lower income areas and probably don't spend a lot of time getting to know the population they are patrolling. And that can be problematic because if you don't know the person who's there, it's hard for you to empathize with them and to understand them. Because, I mean, imagine this. If I live in a neighborhood and I know every single person in the neighborhood, I know every single car that drives around, I know everyone that's there. If I pull someone over, I have a reasonable expectation that I'm going to know who they are. Or if I don't know them specifically, very quickly I'm going to know that they're a friend of a friend, or they're a brother of a friend, or there's someone that is connected to you pretty closely. So in that, I'm probably going to have a different approach when I walk up to that window. But say I don't live there. Say my only interaction with this entire population, wherever, if it's a city, or if it's a suburb, or if it's a apartment complex, like my only interaction with them is when I'm called in to deal with a negative issue. If I'm called in to deal with domestic violence, if I'm called in to deal with drug issues, then my entire interaction is I don't know who I'm going to walk up on. I don't know if they're going to be a good person. I don't know if they're going to be a bad person. So already from the get, my fight or flight, and as I'm not flying away because I am a cop who is trying to do their job, goes into fight mode. I have my hand on my service weapon and I'm walking up ready to expect anything. And I think because of that, you have these issues. And as these young men get older, and luckily their genetic abilities help them climb through the social ladder as an athlete in college who gains exposure and is then drafted in the NFL. And it goes across all the other sports as well. Maybe they don't protest as much, but I have to believe, like, in the NBA, a lot of the people who were there probably didn't grow up with great, financial security in their lives or money or anything like that. I have to think a lot of them grew up just as poor. I know, like, Kevin Durant wasn't well off when he was younger. I know the reason why they donate so much of their time and money to these neighborhoods is because they're from them. So when they see this violence happening, and when players see all this violence occurring, what's instead happening is they're using the platform of exposure they have. Back when they lived there, maybe 30, 40 people heard what they said. But now they're in a national spotlight. So when a Colin Kaepernick kneels down and he protests silently, right? Originally he sat down, and then instead, to show respect to the armed forces, decided to kneel. When he's doing that, he's using that exposure he's developed over the years in order to send a message that something is going on in his community, where the people he loves live, where the people he calls family, and how they're going through this intense negative ordeal. Do I think Colin Kaepernick is probably ever going to be hurt by police officers? No, because he's known. So when a cop rolls up to Colin Kaepernick's window, he knows who he is. He knows he's safe. He knows Colin Kaepernick isn't going to hurt him because he knows him. And I think that's probably the best thing when they talk about dialogue, is how we can integrate police culture and police, the need for police safety in neighborhoods with an effort to get to know the neighborhoods you're patrolling. And things like getting involved in the schools with junior highs and high schools, and getting to know the young men and women who are ending up graduating and entering into the community, and how working with them when they're younger builds positive relationships for when you might have to arrest someone when they're older because of a mistake that's been made. Then you already have rapport that you've built on. And I think that's important. And I think that there's no perfect answer to any situation. But I know what's going on now isn't working. And because of that, when the NFL decides to kind of just have a policy that says, oh no, we're going to just end all of this kneeling by just telling you you're going to be fined, I don't think it solves the problem. What I think it does is it re-emphasizes the power dynamic that's existed in our country for, forever, and the remnants of slavery. Because there's no discourse that's happening here. It's not a conversation that's happening between people. It's a group of highly influential and highly wealthy men who are predominantly white. I know you have Khan in Jacksonville, who's not, but the majority of the owners are all white and all very wealthy, kind of passing this law onto the people who are under them without any of their input, without bringing up, in collective bargaining or in anything like that. And now you're telling them you're going to be fined if you choose to participate in this. And I think that's problematic, because the people who are paying you are telling you they're going to take money from you for standing up for what you believe in. And there's no conversation that you've had that's going to adjust that. I mean, Goodell says in his press conference, the efforts by many of our players sparked awareness and action around the issues of social justice that must be addressed. The platform that we have created together is certainly unique in professional sports and quite unlike American business. We are honored to work with our players to drive progress. But I think that's not what you're doing here. I think what you're doing here is setting a law, a rule, a policy that then has to be enforced punitively instead of a conversation that kind of brings together the people involved. I think the NBA is a lot better at this, because I've heard comments from Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, LeBron James that show that there is an issue going on, but a willingness to have a conversation about it and not to be, fined or penalized or just hurt. Because I think that the NFL and its players are partners. And I think when you make that decision, you take advocacy away. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes and to see if this rule is something that gets tested or if it's a rule that maybe everyone follows because they don't want to lose money. But at the end of the day, I think they went about it the wrong way. I do see a need for the NFL to protect its bottom line. And at the end of the day, it's a company, and a company will move on with or without you no matter who you are, if it's in their best interest. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions. Like, I don't think they would suspend maybe if Tom Brady decided, oh, this is my last season and I'm going to do whatever I want and say whatever I want. I don't think they're going to penalize him in the same way that they would penalize, Jimmy Garoppolo. Just because I don't think the star power is the same. Not to say anything about Jimmy. He did a fine job at the end of last year. But I think that this is going to be tested at some point this upcoming season. And it'll be interesting to see how that works out. So that's it. I kind of wanted to bring these two things up. I definitely think that this is going to be interesting. But I also think that the NFL handled it the wrong way. On the other hand, with the first topic with the UFC, I think this is a great way for them to bounce back from a disappointing 2018. I think that things had to change. I don't think the current model is going to work long term, especially when they paid $4 billion to buy this company. By most accounts, overpaid by a lot. And so I think this is going to take a little pressure off them and provide better fights, because I don't think that there is a better alternative, because that 2 pay-per-view a month was just killing me when you're trying to promote a product and your fights are subpar. I heard the last pay-per-view just did terrible, and that was a Brazil champion in Brazil with Amanda Nunes. That kind of just shows where the UFC's at right now. I think a partnership with ESPN is going to help them put a better product out. But more than that, I think it'll help them present their fighters in different ways. Because I can see ESPN Plus doing something like Kobe Bryant's show, which is amazing. If you haven't checked that out, you should probably see that. It's an amazing show. I think that you can showcase fighters who are not only up and coming, but have maybe kind of taking it round 2 of their career or round 3. For example, Lyoto Machida and what he's done, kind of reviving his career with his knockout win against Belfort. Do I think that there's going to be a magic solution? No. Do I think this is going to fix everything? No. I think the UFC does not represent a lot of their B-side fighters as much as they should. But I think this can help. Their embedded series is amazing. But for me, it's a little too much janky with hand camera kind of production. I think a better bet would probably be like an in-depth sit-down. Like maybe sitting down with Kamaru Usman for a decent portion of time and kind of getting to know who he is. Maybe getting an actual production studio into his gym and have him show some sparring in ways that's not as janky or like looks like it's been provided by the fighter. And I think those videos can be kind of the same after a while. Although this last embedded series, like seeing Kevin Gastelum in Brazil walking around, I think that was amazing. I think that was an awesome way, and seeing Nunes kind of come face to face, kind of walking around, was just awesome. But I think at the end of the day that there needs to be a system-wide change in the way they think about the sport and they think about their fighters, because they're taking great fighters and kind of stacking them against people who are at a different level than them, hoping that they get a knockout win that's going to propel them into this great stratosphere. And I think that's what you're seeing here with this Darren Till and Wonderboy fight. I think you're seeing the UFC just kind of push Till out after his Cerrone win, which was great, don't get me wrong, but I think it should have been maybe 2 more fights before he was given up to Wonderboy. Not that I think that Wonderboy is significantly better than him, but I think you're doing Till a disservice by just pushing him out there and not building his brand. Again, you're trying to get to the bottom dollar, and the UFC has a lot of money to pay back. And until this deal, there wasn't a structure in place for how they were going to recoup it. My only thing is what's going to happen with this Reebok sponsorship after this, because they're making a lot of money, the UFC, with this deal. $1.5 billion over 5 years. A lot of that is going to go back to paying the company back. Paying a lot of the loans they have and stuff with WME. But at the end of the day, their fighters, a lot of them are fighting for $15,000, $20,000, and this company is pocketing billions. Is there going to be a redistribution of some of that money? Is there going to be because there's no collective bargaining yet, right? Project Spearhead is in its infancy still. Still looking to sign people on. So they don't have collective bargaining in the same way that NFL and NBA does. They don't have labor negotiations. They have independent contractors who have a boss that decides their future. Like Yair. His future got decided for him, right? Whatever the situation was, he accepted a fight, didn't accept a fight, whatever the situation was, and then he sent that tweet, which I think was a boneheaded move. Anytime you talk bad about your employer, you're probably not going to like the consequences of that. But I think he had a valid point too. The deal wasn't signed, and he hadn't agreed to a fight. So when people are kind of talking to him about it, he's like, well, that's not true. And I think he jumped on the fake news bandwagon with everything that's going on nationally. But I think to release him like that sends a strong message that to the fighters, you're going to do what we want. But I think it also hurts you in the long run, because now the fighters they've always known, but now they know that they need to worry about number one first. That worrying about the UFC is going to do them a disservice, because when the UFC doesn't benefit, they're not going to worry about you in the same way. And I think that's kind of a painful reminder that at the end of the day, they are these artists that are showing their life's work and are looking to show that their life's work is better than their opponent's life work. And in that moment when they come together, they're not enemies, but they're opponents who, for the most part, respect each other and work hard to be the best version of themselves they can. But at the end of the day, it's still a business. I mean, they're getting paid. The sponsorship is a little ridiculous, but they're getting paid, and at the end of the day, if their money isn't there, it isn't there. And they get let go. And that's unfortunate. Do I think Yair's going to get signed by someone else? Yeah, probably Bellator. They probably have the most to offer him. I don't think he's going to get the same amount of exposure. Maybe if he goes to one, but I don't know if he's going to do that. But I definitely think Bellator has an opening for him to redefine his career and kind of have the second chapter. He got knocked out. Now he's going to come back. I hope the best. I hope he comes back and he has a long run of success, because he's a young man kind of figuring stuff out. I mean, we all are, for the most part, figuring things out for ourselves as we go through life. But I think he kind of realized the mistake he made, and I think he'll play things differently. Hopefully, that'll be the end of that, and he has success going forward. The one thing about this executive rights thing, I think the UFC is still behind professional wrestling when it comes to exposure. Part of that is because professional wrestling is so scripted that they can make the exposure to what they want. They can build whoever they want in whatever way they want. And the UFC is limited by fighters having to fight and perform. So while they can support and build a athlete through kind of just this exposure, they are ultimately relying on someone like Conor McGregor to come through and KO Jose Aldo, or come through and piece apart Eddie Alvarez, like to build their star, with their own hands. So I think because of that, and the reason why I say they're behind SmackDown, or wrestling in general on WWE, specifically SmackDown Live, is because Fox chose to give money to bring SmackDown Live over to Fox instead of giving money to the UFC. And when you have a finite amount of money, you decide to allocate it in whatever way. I think the way you allocate money is very important. I think ESPN is a better partner for the UFC, because I think ESPN is seen as a little more authoritative when it comes to sports, And I think getting that exposure will bring a lot of people who might have known what the UFC was. I mean, don't get me wrong, I am by no means an expert. I am slightly above a casual fan. I watch all the cards. I try to make most of the prelims to watch. But at the end of the day, I am not a trained martial artist. I don't have that. But I love watching the sport. I love watching the art form that takes place when two men or two women are kind of placed together in a cage. And I think ESPN will bring that out. I think ESPN will allow for better exposure for not only the sport, but the athletes. And I think you'll see more stars come out because of it. I think ESPN has just a better way to emphasize what the UFC is about. I think Fox, for the most part, failed. While they have Skip Bayless, Shannon Sharp, they didn't necessarily use them to promote the sport. And I think that was a mistake. And I think that's one that ESPN sees already. I know Ariel's headed over there, so they already see that, and Chael as well. So they already see the need to promote the sport with the platform as well as the sport itself, because I think mutually they can both help bring massive amounts of people to each other. All the UFC fans are now leaving Fox and coming to ESPN, right? They'll watch a card and then probably stick around to watch SportsCenter afterwards. And a lot of the normal SportsCenter fans who kind of just have that on their TV when they come home after work, they're going to get to watch these UFC events and kind of introduce them to that world. I think it's just a wonderful decision for these two to come together. And I think that's something that WME, Dana White, and all of them have done well. It still, we'll see how it goes. We'll see how that partnership works out. I know the UFC has kind of been running everything on their own and just basically using Fox as a platform to show their media. I think that's going to change. ESPN is owned by Disney. I think it's going to definitely change how some of the fighters are represented. I don't know how well fighters like Nate Diaz are going to be received by ESPN, or Nick Diaz, even Colby Covington. I don't know how they're going to be received, because I know for a large part ESPN and Disney are very aware and very specific on how their brand is used. They're just not hesitant to step away from situations that are harmful to its overall brand. And with Disney just being so diversified, I don't know if Disney is going to be able to just let them do whatever they want. I mean, you have to think how long it took Disney to put out Deadpool, which is R-rated and kind of not what Disney's about, versus all of the other Marvel movies. I mean, that's a multi-billion-dollar profit for them as well. So I don't know if they're going to be as easy with the UFC being as wild as it was. And I think that's what Dana wants. I was watching season 5 of The Ultimate Fighter. There's a scene where there's like a fight that breaks out at their house, and you see Dana just kicking people out for that, because that's not how he wants the sport to be represented. I think because of that, you're going to have a shift in the way athletes conduct themselves and how they behave on and off the camera. Because please believe there'll be some pressure. I mean, if John Jones gets caught doing something stupid, where he hit the lady, pregnant lady in his car while he was intoxicated, if there's something like that happens, I think ESPN might push things a little more, because they are partners and they don't want to promote a product that hurts their image, because they've spent a very long time and a lot of money to develop an image, and they won't hesitate. like 1.5 billion seems like a ton of money, and it is, right? For the UFC, it's life-changing. But I think for Disney, 1.5 billion, while not a write-off, it's a calculated risk that can be taken back and not interfered with. I think that's basically where I'm at with that. I think they can lose money in a way that the UFC cannot. So it's going to be hard for them. But I think this is what Dana wanted. Dana wanted to be on SportsCenter. He wanted his knockouts to be on the top 10. I think that's where he sees that. I think that's where he sees this development going. And that's amazing because it puts a whole new market onto the fight game. A whole new market. I think that this is going to be a good thing. Thank you guys for checking out my first episode. I hope to put up more content soon. And if you liked it, please subscribe. I will be back.